All right. Thank you everyone so much for coming. We are really excited to be having this conversation, and we're so happy that you can join us. So my name is Theodora Skiatis. I'm the president of Harvard W3D, Women in Defense, Diplomacy, and Development. Oh, there's a comment. Can you hear anything? Can folks hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So I think, Eshan, maybe it's a voice issue on your end. Yeah, so I'm the president of W3D, Women in Defense, Diplomacy, and Development, and we, alongside ANHW, so Harvard Alumni Network for Harvard Women, and the HKS New England Alumni Association, and the HKS Women's Network, which is also a global organization, are really excited to be partnering in organizing this event. So thank you for coming. And now Litzy's going to kick it off with a poll to get a sense of everyone's perspective. So thank you so much for joining. We're really excited to be having this conversation. And thank you, Litzy, for all of your work in organizing this great event.
Thank you, Theodora. For the information for the participants, there's a poll right in front of you. We just want to get a sense of how familiar the audience is about the current affairs in India. So if you could just take a few seconds to fill it, it'll be helpful for us. As the results come in, I would like to introduce myself. My name is Litcy Kurisinkal. I'm an alumni of Harvard Kennedy School. I'm also the president of Alumni Network for Harvard Women, Chicago chapter. Looks like our audience is pretty familiar with Indian affairs, which really would help us during the discussion. So as I said, we have a brilliant panel here with us today. And it's truly a great privilege to have them as our speakers today. Mr. Aakar Patel, he was the former executive director of Amnesty International India, a very bold leader, a bold defender of the defender of human rights during his time in Amnesty International. Apart from that, he is a widely read columnist in India. His writings are very powerful, written without fear or favor. And so his credibility is pretty high among his readers. Thank you so much, Mr. Aakar Patel, for joining us today. Ms. Arundhati Roy, who needs no introduction, but her book, The God of Small Things, and the Booker Prize winner title precede her name. But she's more than that, like her characters in the books, like Anjum, Miss Jabeen, Jannat House from the Ministry of Utmost Happiness. They are like characters that, at least to me, they are part of my family. It's like they're living with me. She has written extensively on various social issues, which kind of tempts at least me and many others to label her as a social activist or a political activist. But she prefers to identify herself as a writer. But her writings have definitely influenced many to look at social justice from a different perspective. Shadan Farasat, our very own Harvard alumni from Harvard Law School. He is a practicing advocate of Supreme Court of India. He is more popularly known for one very important case that he fought on triple talaq. Triple talaq is an exclusive right Muslim husbands in India had. They could instantaneously divorce their wives by uttering uttering the word talaq 3 times. So Ms. Varisha Farasat and Ms. Shadan Farasat pleaded on behalf of Muslim women's rights organizations, and currently it stands unconstitutional. Thank you so much, Shadan, and welcome home. Before asking Arundhati Roy to respond to Aakar, you are not familiar. You're very familiar actually with criticisms and kind of restrictions. Like when you wrote back in 2002, when you wrote your article against mass displacement of villagers near Narmada Dam, or when you shared your anguish through an article when your dear friend Professor G.N. Sai Baba of Delhi University was arrested. You had to face contempt of court, by the Supreme Court of India. even the book that you wrote, Walking with the Comrades, you were trying to give the other side, other side of the story of a movement that was considered as a national security, considered as a national security threat. So what I would like to know is, have these restrictions on freedom of expressions or right to dissent, how has it affected your writings, and how has it affected the issues that you wanted to talk about it? And you're welcome to respond to Aakar's points.
No, I entirely agree with what he just said, and he laid out the legal framework and the fact that, even constitutionally, it isn't as though these rights are guaranteed and then there is a violation of the constitution happening. Of course, there's creative interpretations, but we never had the freedom. For example, criminal contempt of court, any criticism of the court. In fact, just now, a friend of mine, a very well-known advocate, Prashant Bhushan, he was here, 10 minutes ago, and we just saw on the news that he's been charged with criminal contempt of court for two things, one unknown and one a case dredged up from 11 years ago. So, the vindictiveness of the state. But I think, what I would like to talk about is how, apart from the state, you have institutions like courts, you have an institution like the mass media, which is now become almost like, some of those television anchors are like lynch mobs of their own, So there's this massive sort of baying, bullying consensus that they work up. When I wrote Walking with the Comrades, that was it. Adivasis in the forest, of course, many of them belonging to guerrilla groups, were fighting displacement. Their land was being unconstitutionally given to mining companies. But on the media, you were seeing, these guys with kind of black ski caps, and they were being called terrorists and sort of merged together with the Lashkar-e-Toiba. And there was a kind of, like I said, a bullying consensus that happens. And one of the really terrifying things here is the outsourcing of censorship, and the outsourcing to these vigilante mobs who range from lynching, killing on the streets, to trolling, to bullying, to threatening. Of course, if you're a woman, then the threats are, extremely sexual and so on. But what has happened in this country is that if you look at India, think about it. Can any Indian intellectual today say what Ambedkar used to say, or what Gandhi used to say, or what Nehru used to say? You can't say those things anymore in this country. You can't say the things about Hinduism that Ambedkar said today. You can quote him, but you can't say them. Nobody can say them. Nobody can really express their opinion freely and fearlessly. And what you're seeing from, let's say, the 1960s, where you had people's movements, intellectuals, writers talking about justice, talking about the redistribution of land, the redistribution of wealth. You had the Naxal movement, to every other kind of radical movement, to obviously the elections in Kerala, which threw up the first, democratically elected communist government in the world. But we're talking about a discourse on justice that then just became shrunk down to human rights. And through that, we went through, when you're talking about the redistribution of land and wealth in the 60s, to the 80s and 90s, it became, please don't displace Adivasi people from land that they're on, don't grab their land, to now it's just basic human rights which are under threat. So the way India has moved from a democracy to a kind of an illiberal state where these institutions exist as structures, but they've been completely hollowed out, including the machinery of elections. We are more or less reduced to being a one-party democracy, which is an oxymoron, because everyone else, I mean, forget the dissent of people, I mean, protests, people's movements, all major politicians of any threat, of any stripe, are either in jail or they are what I think of as J. Edgar Hooverized. You know, they're either being kind of blackmailed by criminal cases, or they have criminal cases against them. Everyone is more or less silent, you know. So you have a situation where there is a kind of fire in the ducts, institutionally and structurally, apart from just the dissent on the streets. Things are failing at a pace which is truly terrifying, you know. So yeah, so in that atmosphere, one lives and works, you know. So you mentioned you know, the Ministry of Utmost Happiness. I remember just before it came out, you know, there was a Bollywood actor saying I should be used as a human shield in Kashmir. I've just watched mainstream TV news anchors just look at the camera, reading out the main news, and address me directly, threaten, you know, you write something, and then there are endless programs for hours on end, you know, not just me, but whoever they are going after at that point. And they are literally putting people in danger. Look at the young student, Omar Khalid. I mean, people, they lied about him so much. They faked videos about him. They called him a terrorist. They said so many things, and eventually someone did try to kill him, and they're still going after him. So, you know, all these institutions, along with the government, collude in just taking away the oxygen. There isn't any oxygen to breathe right now. I mean, look at Kashmir. There are thousands of people in prison in Kashmir, preventive detention right now. For a year they've been in there. The prisons are full of coronavirus. You know, that is true of prisons all over, of course.
Going back to Arundhati's point about total collapse of institution and especially media, role of media, like I remember your article, The Silence of the Loudest Sound in New York Times that you wrote about Kashmir. You had used a phrase, lynched by the TV is most likely is the new political phenomena in India. 2 days back, you wrote you wrote an article on the injustice cannot go on forever, where you touched upon a lot of points about how arbitrary detention of human rights defenders, about so many issues that are going on. How do you think media has influenced the collective conscience of our society? Has Indians lost their agency, or were they always influenced by media and external environment?
Well, I mean, that's a very wide-ranging question. You know, one of the questions I think a lot of Indian activists and political people ponder over, I certainly do, is the acquiescence of people. You know, like we were talking about when the lockdown was called with 4 hours notice, and millions of workers were left on the streets of cities, homeless, without food, without transport. They began to walk home miles and miles, thousands of miles for days, beaten by the police, sprayed down with disinfectant like cattle. And yet, I personally couldn't stay at home. I went out and I watched this marching on the, you know, Delhi-UP border, and you'd see these tens of thousands of people being humiliated by a few policemen, and you wonder, why do they take it, you know? And then I think perhaps it has something to do with caste and with the hierarchy and the division in Indian society, where everyone is oppressed by someone and has someone to oppress. And so there is such a difficulty in making solidarity, across communities and so on. That is one thing. But when it comes to the media, you know, look at the penetration of the media from the early 90s, you know, when perhaps there's no country in the world that has like more than 450 24-hour news channels, always looking to sensationalize something. Then you look at the ownership structures of those TV channels, as well as many newspapers, and you see a massive conflict of interest in terms of who owns them, who's advertising on them, and what they seek, you know, whose side they seek to be on. They seek to be on their own side, because they are not, it's not that they are with the establishment, they are the establishment. And, you know, so that is a terrifying thing. But now they are literally like suckling piglets, you know, I mean, just spewing a kind of hatred. Like when the corona lockdown was announced, and you know, the people, there was a meeting in Nizamuddin close to my house, and you know, it turned out to be, all those people got locked in. It was a meeting that had been organized way before the lockdown was announced, and then they were locked into this very small space, and that space turned out to be a super spreader in the Nizamuddin Dargah, you know, near the Dargah. And the TV channels were just openly going on about Corona jihad and describing Muslims as human bombs. And, you know, there was the social media buzzing with this fake news where you're stigmatizing Muslims as spreaders of disease. So there's a whole, and the social media isn't just some random collection of people sending messages. It's, you know, there are organized WhatsApp groups, hundreds of thousands of them, you know, which work for the BJP in the elections. And the fake news isn't just something that someone came up with, you know. So it's a very institutionalized way of disseminating a kind of hateful ideology at many, many, many levels. So that is why we're in a position of so much danger now. I mean, the courts, when Shadan was talking about the courts, I was thinking, look at what the Supreme Court did with the National Register of Citizens. It still hasn't decided whether it's constitutional or not. Whereas in Assam, havoc has already been wreaked among millions of people who have been left off the register. It so happens that those very people are now suffering the floods of the Brahmaputra. You know, 45 lakh people have been displaced from their homes. Half of them don't know whether they're citizens or not. The Supreme Court has just sat back and allowed the execution of something to happen and kept the matter of whether or not it's constitutional to discuss at a later stage. So it's an insane situation in so many ways.
So are you saying that, you know, Indian citizens, like, you know, I mean, there is a majoritarian support, you know, for these institutions that are propagating whatever messages they wish to share. So are you, I mean, there is a support from a majority. So where is that consciousness? Like, you know, you talked about arbitrary detentions of, you know, especially the most popular case, like the arrest of many human rights defenders who literally have no, you know, criminal background, arrests of students, student activities, and so on during lawyers, activists, peasant leaders, and so on. So why are the Indian citizens silent? You know, do they feel something is happening, and are they just keeping quiet, or are they being complicit? And especially in the decision of Kashmir, most people were really happy about that. You know, there may be a minority who thought, you know, who saw the social injustice in it. So where does our collective consciousness lie?
Well, you know, I was just thinking that you use this word collective consciousness quite often, and our collective conscience is a phrase that came from a judgment by the Supreme Court on the case of the Parliament attack in 2001, which I have written quite extensively about. And when they sentenced Muhammad Afzal Guru to be hanged, they said that, I mean, I wish I had the exact phrasing, but it was more or less that we have not found direct evidence that he belonged to a terrorist group, but in order to satisfy the collective conscience of society, we are sentencing him to death. I mean, I'm paraphrasing, but this was just a very, very shocking judgment. Of course, when in the years that Afzal was in jail, there was, the BJP used to campaign कि देश अभी शर्मिंदा है, Afzal abhi bhi zinda hai, which means the nation is ashamed because Afzal is still alive. He was one of the prime accused in the case of the Parliament attack. I mean, it's a long story, but the major masterminds and so on were all acquitted. And Afzal himself had talked about being tortured by a policeman in Kashmir called Davinder Singh and being forced to go to Delhi and buy a car and so on. Anyway, he was hanged in order to satisfy the collective conscience of society. And then a few months ago, that very Davinder Singh was arrested with two Hizbul, I'm not sure which group they belong to, but two quote unquote terrorists. And he's in prison now, although the police in Delhi have not opposed his bail because the charge sheet wasn't made and so on. But you see the interconnection of all these wheels, and the collective conscience of society was created and is created by this 24-hour drip feed of hatred from the TV channels. So just before the Corona lockdown, there was a wonderful uprising of millions of young people against the Citizenship Amendment Act and the National Register of Citizens. And that was an uprising of conscience, really, of saying, come on, this is not the country that we want to belong to, this country of hatred and discrimination. But with the COVID lockdown, with the stigmatization of Muslims as the spreaders of disease, a lot of that solidarity has also come undone, apart from the fact that the lockdown meant that people can't come out on the streets, and what has happened with the lockdown obviously is that the economy collapsed, political solidarity was shredded, mass arrests are going on right now using the virus, the lockdown, and the virus, which was brought in obviously from the air, from foreign travelers, has now been taken across the country by migrants. So the lockdown itself as a piece of imagination also was for a country that was in the imagination of the Prime Minister, a country of people who did have homes to be locked down into, a country of people who do have balconies to come out and bang their pots and pans to celebrate I don't know what. And obviously now, you see an imagination and a system and institutions that are in place pretending to be a democracy, and therefore it's harder for people to see behind that smoke screen. Even today, every diplomat in Delhi will tell you, oh, but India is such a great democracy. The press is so robust, they're shouting all the time.
So I think we all agree, there are enough problems exist in India. Now, if we can just kind of, in the interest of time, how can we kind of fix it? Like, Aakar's point of, such huge government control on media, and generally kind of, despite the incompetence of the government machinery or the state machinery, it has control over media and narratives. Generally looks like our democracy is in kind of backsliding, but how can we strengthen the institutions that we have and look for a better future for India? Arundhati, do you want to start with it? Or
Well, honestly, let's see. I think that's a naive question and a naive approach to it, because things are, it's like, we haven't even talked about the fact that the prime minister and almost all the ministers belong to an organization called the RSS, probably the oldest and most functioning fascist organization in the world, with boots on the ground, ideologically fascist. They have not captured the state quite in the same way as fascists in the 30s did. But each of these institutions have been penetrated, and this is an organization which has tremendous amount of money. I mean, everything that's been said about funding applies to it too, and it leaves no footprints. It has no bank account, So it's not you can fix something if that thing wants to be fixed, but that beast is moving in a completely different direction now, And the problem is that because of, even before COVID hit, as you know, because of demonetization, just like the lockdown, the overnight announcement of demonetization, as somebody said, as an economist said, it was like shooting the tires off a moving car. Then came the lockdown, it was like removing those tires altogether. We're going into a predicted minus 9.5 growth, So what we are doing, the fights on the street are an attempt to fix, as you call it, to bring, to drag things back to a space where there is some accountability, but that is being hammered, and I actually don't agree that people like me or Aakar are allowed to function because it's incompetence. It's a very calculated idea of who to go after, who to leave out, almost every person that used to sit at my table is in jail now, So, someone like me is a mantelpiece display. Look, she's out, so we are a democracy, But the waters are closing on all of us in ways which are, and it's, yes, of course, there's levels of incompetence, but you go to a place like Kashmir, the amount of intelligence, competence, pinpoint accuracy with which they have kept, those people down in that way. The fact that for a whole year, the whole world is reeling after 2 months of lockdown, with internet, with music, with online workout videos, Look at Kashmir, almost a year of rolling lockdowns with no internet, no online studies. The doctors can't literally function without, the things they need. The businesses are collapsing. It's a lockdown within a lockdown within a lockdown. This is a lot of competence there, a lot of competence when it comes to repression, a lot of incompetence when it comes to understanding historically how things work. Right now, you're seeing the whole region turning, a new power rising. The what's going on the border is not a small skirmish. So there's no formula to fix it, except.
Sorry, and just kind of in the interest of time, I'm just going to, in the recent video, A Reckoning, you definitely kind of showed a sense of hope. This pandemic can be like a portal through which, there is a possibility that we could kind of, carve a better future is what, So you do, despite all the problems and anguishes, that we all know exist, you definitely kind of show a sense of hope. There is a possibility. So how can that hope be realized?
So hope has nothing to do with the reason, but that hope can be realized by this battle, by those of us who understand what's going on, not retreating, by understanding how structurally how these institutions are collapsing, and to continue doing what can we do? We continue doing what we do, whether there's hope or not. For me, the hope was more on an international level. Are human beings understanding that COVID is a children's toy compared to climate change, and perhaps human beings do realize that this kind of hyper consumerist, extractive capitalism is not going to work, you know. And when human beings do realize that, you have you have the Black Lives Matter movement, which the young people do understand what's going on. There is also an argument against that form of capitalism, you know, that form of imperialism. So the hope comes from understanding, you know. Hope doesn't come from just thinking that we can just tweak a few things here and fix it. It's beyond that now in India, you know. So what you see as a smoke screen, yes, I mean, a few people among the elite are having robust debates and it's looking fine, but it's not at all fine. I mean, there are thousands of people in jail, not just the activists, lawyers, scholars, but thousands of villagers who have fought for just holding on to what little they have, being arrested under the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act. You have, you know, so the task is huge, and what we are up against is formidable. And I think the important thing is, I saw that one of the questions in your poll was, how important is it for India to remain a democracy? And people understand that it's very, very important. But that is, I mean, we cannot think of ourselves as a democracy now, because even for reasons of these electoral bonds and many things that have been brought up, even the election machinery is compromised. It's compromised completely now, you know. So when you have an election, I said the last election was like a Ferrari racing against a few old bicycles, because of the amount of money, data, information, and bigotry on one side, and the other completely depleted.
Thank you guys so much. This has been an incredibly thought-provoking conversation, and has given us a lot of food for thought, and hopefully also productive next steps. It would be great if we could continue the conversation and substantiate it with follow-up action. But I think that I speak on behalf of everyone when I thank all three of you very much for your generous time, your candor, and your reflections. This has been a really powerful conversation. So thank you very, very much. We really appreciate that.